Wonderful. So yes, I wrote my master's thesis about urban transition experiments to reduce car use in Lund Municipality. Most of us here probably remember this picture of the groundbreaking moment at the COP21 in Paris in 2015, when representatives of 196 state parties agreed on a universally adopted treaty on climate change and to pursue efforts to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. The IPCC special report on the 1.5 degrees Celsius target from 2018 emphasizes that we need a decrease of global greenhouse gas emissions by about 50% until 2030 to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. And reducing emissions that drastically will require wide-ranging transitions of all societal systems and sectors. Lund is a city that has recognized the importance and the potential of urban climate action to meet global climate goals. Lund has developed an ambitious climate action plan and aims to become climate neutral by 2030. And with this aim, Lund is not only a climate leader in Sweden, but also a role model for other cities in the European Union. However, Lund's Climate Policy Council declared that emissions are not declining rapidly enough and that Lund will miss its climate goal for 2030 if the current trend of emission reduction continues. And a major challenge to the emission reductions is the local transport sector. Transport emissions have hardly declined in the past 30 years, and today they contribute about 50% of local emissions. And around 3/4 of the transport emissions are from private car use. So to achieve the climate goal for 2030, transport emissions and especially car use must be reduced rapidly in Lund. And this led me to my research aim to support the transition of Lund's transport sector and thus the achievement of the local climate goal for 2030 by developing a knowledge base for the implementation of transition experiments to reduce local car use. And these are the 3 research questions that guided my research to develop the knowledge base for transition experiments. So first, which city-level interventions have effectively reduced car use in cities in the EU? Then what stakeholders and collaborations are involved in the planning and decision-making of effective city-level interventions to reduce car use? And what potential do these effective city-level interventions have to function as transition experiments to reduce car use in Lund? This brings us to the theory of my thesis and the question why I focused on developing a knowledge base for the implementation of transition experiments. So transition experiments are a key component of transition management. And transition management is a novel and action-oriented governance tool to promote transition processes. Transition management includes principles such as using long-term frameworks to develop short-term policies, applying a learning philosophy, developing long-term visions, and encouraging stakeholder participation. And I considered transition management a valuable approach for my research, since it allows researchers and practitioners to steer and accelerate urban transitions. It complements rather than replaces ongoing governance activities. And I found that many principles and practices of transition management, such as the ones that I mentioned before, coincide with activities of Lund's climate work and therefore suit the climate political landscape in Lund. And transition experiments are innovative short-term actions that tackle specific transition challenges, such as high car use is a transition challenge to Lund's transport transition. And most importantly, transition experiments have the potential to significantly accelerate transition processes when they fulfill 3 criteria. They should be new approaches that differ from existing practices. They should be suitable to address the targeted transition challenge, and they should be feasible to implement in the near term and with the available resources. Then how did I collect the data for my research? I first conducted a systematic literature and document review to identify the effective city-level interventions to reduce car use. And I reviewed 369 peer-reviewed scientific articles, of which I retained 10 for the analysis, and 407 institutional reports, mostly from EU databases such as ELTIS or Civitas, of which I retained 18 for the analysis. And the number of retained articles that I could retain was so little because first, there was a lack of articles and reports that evaluated interventions to reduce car use based on actual measured outcomes rather than simulations or expected outcomes. And second, there was a lack of articles that contained quantitative evidence of the achieved car use reduction and not only qualitative evidence. So that they, for example, would not only say the car use was reduced successfully, but car use was reduced by 20%, for example. And so in the end, I retained a total of 28 documents, which are used to categorize and classify the interventions to answer research question 1, and to identify and classify stakeholder types and collaborations to answer research question 2. And in the next step, I took the results of my first 2 research questions to inform an interview guide for expert interviews that I conducted with 4 experts of Lund's transport sector. And to answer my 3rd research question, I asked for the expert's opinion regarding the potential of the interventions that I had identified before to function as transition experiments to reduce car use in Lund. And now we come to my results. Which city-level interventions have effectively reduced car use in cities in the EU? So I identified 26 cases of effective city-level interventions to reduce car use as purposive attempts to reduce local car use in a city. And based on the measures that were contained in these cases, I classified them into 12 different intervention types that you can see on the right-hand side in the table. And the 12 different intervention types I further grouped into 7 different and overarching intervention categories. And among the 12 intervention types, I found 3 intervention types that are particularly effective in reducing car use. The first is a congestion charge, which reduced the car traffic across the border of the charging zone between 12 and 33%. Then a limited traffic zone, which reduced the car traffic in the city center of the respective city between 10 and 20%. And a parking and traffic control, which reduced the car traffic also in the city center of the respective city between 11 and 19%. I also classified the policy instruments that were utilized by the interventions that I identified. And I distinguished 4 different policy instruments, namely regulatory instruments, so for example, rules or prohibitions, then economic instruments, such as charges or subsidies, information and education measures, so for example, information campaigns and advice or marketing, and also public goods and services, such as the expansion of infrastructure or services. And when I looked at the 12 intervention types that I had identified, I found that all intervention types apply a mix of different policy instruments rather than relying on a single policy instrument. And I also found that most intervention types combine the policy instrument public goods and services with either economic or regulatory instruments or information and education. I also identified the approach how interventions reduce car use. And there I distinguished in the push and pull approach, where the push approach disincentivizes car use by increasing the costs for car use or by imposing rules or controlling car use. And the pull approach incentivizes low carbon and non-motorized travel alternatives to the car, for example, by expanding the infrastructure or services or by offering monetary incentives. And here I found that 50%, so 6 of the 12 intervention types, applied a pure pull approach to reduce car use. And the other half, the other 50% of the intervention types combined a pull and push approach. So they both incentivize travel alternatives and disincentivize car use. And interestingly, no intervention type applied a pure push approach to reduce car use. And then when it comes to the stakeholders and collaborations that were involved, I distinguished leading stakeholders and partner stakeholders. Oh, there's somebody in the waiting room. Sorry, I will quickly admit. Okay. Yes, as I said, I distinguished leading and partner stakeholders. And leading stakeholders are the stakeholders who initiate and lead interventions. And partner stakeholders work in close collaborations with the leading stakeholders to support their work. And here I found that most cases of interventions were planned and decided upon in collaborations between a leading stakeholder with 1 to 4 different partner stakeholders. Then who are the leading and partner stakeholders? I found that the most common type of leading stakeholders who initiate and lead the interventions were local city governments. And the most common type of partner stakeholders who supported the planning and decision-making of the interventions were private stakeholders, such as local companies and businesses, then public transport provider, and also the civil society. And now the findings of my third research questions. So what potential do the interventions have to function as transition experiments to reduce car use in Lund? Based on the expert interviews that I had conducted with 2 researchers of Lund University and also 2 employees of Lund Municipality, and with the help of the transition management approach, which says that transition experiments should be new, suitable to address the targeted challenge, and also feasible to implement to fulfill their potential. Based on both, I identified 4 intervention types that have a high potential to function as transition experiments to reduce car use in Lund, 2 intervention types with a moderate potential, and 6 intervention types with a low potential to function as transition experiments to reduce car use in Lund. Then, based on my findings, what are policy implications for Lund? So when I compared the 3 criteria that determine the potential of transition experiments to reduce car use, so the novelty, suitability, and feasibility of the different intervention types, I found that interventions are more suitable when they focus on living in business areas beyond the city center of Lund, rather than the city center itself. And I also identified 2 challenges to the feasibility of implementing interventions as transition experiments. Namely, first, that relevant local stakeholders, such as incumbent politicians or also local employers, might oppose more restrictive interventions to reduce car use. And second, that the available resources of Lund Municipality, so the available time, money, and employees, might constrain the implementation of transition experiments. And when I compared the results of my first and third research questions, I also discovered tensions between the feasibility to implement interventions as transition experiments and their novelty and effectiveness in reducing car use. So on the one hand, interventions which are more new and radical in Lund were often not viewed as feasible to implement by the experts. And on the other hand, interventions that I had identified as being particularly effective in reducing car use, they were also often not considered feasible to implement by the experts. So considering these tensions, I found that 3 interventions might offer a good trade-off between, on the one hand, their potential to function as a transition experiments to reduce car use in Lund, as well as their effectiveness in reducing car use. And these 3 intervention types are the parking and traffic control, which includes the removal of parking spaces, then the introduction of car-free streets, and also the expansion of bike and pedestrian-friendly infrastructure. Then mobility services for commuters, which includes fare-free public transport for employees, and also shuttle buses between local businesses and companies and public transport hubs, and a workplace parking charge, which includes, as the name says, a charge for car parking places at local employers. And the revenues of the charge are then used, for example, for public infrastructure investments. And then building on my findings and the transition management approach, I propose the following steps to develop and implement transition experiments to reduce car use in Lund. First, the formation of a transition team with employees of Lund Municipality that can function as the leading stakeholder of potential transition experiments. Then, to assess how the interventions could be best possibly translated into transition experiments in Lund. Also to engage and involve different stakeholders in the process to ensure the inclusion of different values and interests. So, for example, local employee organizations such as Lund Climate Alliance or Skånetrafiken in the civil society. Then also important to develop a process and budget plan, especially to address the challenge of the available resources of Lund Municipality. And to develop an internal and external communication of the experiments to develop support of relevant stakeholders. And finally, it will also be important to ensure a monitoring and evaluation of the experiments to facilitate the learning process for future policy making. Thank you very much for listening. And now I'm very happy to answer your questions if you have any.